Calm down, ma'am, the cop hissed through gritted teeth, his rough hand shoving the woman's head onto the scorching hood of the car under the suburban afternoon sun. He sneered, cheap cigarette smoke blowing into the face of the elegantly dressed woman in a pink suit. Icy handcuffs clamped tightly around her slender wrists. A cruel declaration that, here, skin-color determined guilt. But that arrogant smile vanished when 3 pitch-black SUVs roared onto the scene, shattering the tranquility of the campground. The man who emerged was no Uber driver, as he'd sneered, but the regional FBI director. No shouting, just the icy gaze of the most powerful man in the state as he saw his wife pinned down like a criminal. A look that made the local officer's aggression dissolve into terror. When the handcuffs were removed, what fell away was not just the injustice, but a curtain concealing a horrifying conspiracy. Hidden in her purse lining was not a weapon, but a USB drive containing a blacklist of illegal surveillance operations, proving that this arrest was no accident, but a thinly veiled intimidation tactic disguised as racial profiling. Was justice truly served when the 2 officers were convicted? Or was it merely a pawn sacrificed so the real puppet master in the shadows could continue to observe through an overhead camera lens? If someone treated your family the way he treated her, what would you do? Comment below, and don't look away. The next truth is even worse than you imagine. The afternoon in Woodlake turned golden like a thin layer of dust settling over the lake's surface. Nadia Evans drove her black SUV into the lot and paused for a few seconds, glancing at the line of people seated on camping chairs. They didn't say anything, but the way they watched her car was enough to make her feel she was stepping into a place that wasn't meant for her. She opened the door and placed her foot on the soft grass, followed by a beat of silence before everything returned to normal. She knew that feeling too well. The kind of silence that says something without saying it, like her presence had just shifted a picture everyone else was used to seeing. Nadia opened the trunk, pulled out a food bag, and a grilling kit. The breeze carried the scent of charred meat from a group of families at the far corner of the lake. An older man glanced over his shoulder and said something to his wife low enough that she couldn't hear the words, but clear enough that she knew she was the topic. A group of teenagers sitting near the water went quiet for a moment, glanced her way, then looked off again, the kind of glance quick enough to seem nothing, but sharp enough to remind her she didn't belong. Nadia set the bag down on the grass, opened the marinated meat container, laid out a beige picnic cloth, and sent a message to her husband. "You come later." The phone vibrated softly to confirm the message had been sent, but the atmosphere around her didn't change. Laughter, country music playing from a small speaker in the distance, and the smell of barbecue smoke blended into the breeze, creating a peacefulness that came with an asterisk, as if everyone here belonged to the same world, and she was just passing through. She turned on the grill, adjusted the flame low, and placed the meat on the grate. A child ran past, glanced at her for a moment, then turned and dashed back toward their parents. Nadia didn't blame them. Children often mirror the doubt adults plant in them. She breathed slowly, holding on to the calm she'd spent years learning to live with. Her eyes scanned the lake surface, glowing with golden light, where small boats drifted gently. A weekend-perfect scene. One she could have fully enjoyed if not for being in a place where every glance made her hold her posture a little straighter. Just as she turned to grab the marinade, the sound of an engine echoed from the dirt road behind the campsite. It wasn't the sound of a car just passing through. It was the sound of a car slowing down fast. Nadia frowned slightly and turned her head. The patrol car stopped a few dozen meters away, and the door flung open harder than necessary. 2 officers stepped out. Wade opened the door with force, like he had something to prove. Torrance slammed his shut with his heel, then swept his gaze across the entire campsite. They didn't spread out to look around. Their eyes locked straight on her, like someone who had found exactly the trouble they were hoping to start. Nadia stood tall, hand still on the grill table. Wade walked toward her with steady steps, his eyes moving from the SUV to her body, with that all-too-familiar look she'd seen in more places than she cared to remember. Torrance followed behind, muttering something low enough for only them to hear, just loud enough to share a laugh. Nadia didn't catch the words, but the tone carried something she recognized. Easy contempt. The kind some people wear like breath, in places where no one ever expects someone like her. She watched them approach, not flinching, not smiling. Just standing there, hand steady, gaze level. She knew this type. She knew what they'd do if she looked nervous. She knew what they'd do if she moved too fast. Wade spoke first. He didn't ask if she was all right. Didn't ask what she was doing. He went straight to it. "What are you doing here?" Nadia told him she was waiting for her husband and just came to grill a little food. A standard answer. Normal, like anyone else here. Wade glanced at Torrance, then asked again with a tone already tired of her. "This your car?" When Nadia nodded, he smirked a smirk that didn't bother hiding the suspicion and judgment behind it. Torrance cut in, his voice blunt. "Doesn't look like it." Nadia kept her voice even. "I'm just here for dinner." The air went quiet for half a second. Wade tilted his head and glanced around, as if searching for a reason to stay longer than necessary. "It's quiet here. I noticed you when I pulled in." Nadia felt her heartbeat pick up slightly, but her tone didn't change. "I'm just waiting for my husband." Wade pressed his lips together, then looked straight at her longer than what could be called polite. None of the nearby families turned to look, but Nadia knew they heard every word exchanged. Sensed the current of tension running through the space between her and the two men in front of her. A breeze passed, fluttering the edge of the picnic blanket. Nadia adjusted the grill, trying to keep everything as normal as possible because she knew exactly how quickly a moment like this could turn. Wade stepped half a pace closer, like he was closing the gap to test her response. Torrance squinted slightly, smiling faintly, the kind of smile that came with seeing something out of place. Nadia looked directly at both of them, not with defiance, not with fear, just a calm presence that, sometimes, was exactly what made men like them more uncomfortable than anything else. She noticed it when Wade looked down at her white shoes, then up to her pink blazer, then back at the SUV. His eyes skimmed everything with a silent question written all over them. "What kind is this?" Nadia adjusted her sleeve lightly, not out of nerves, but to keep herself steady. She knew this scene was far from over, and no one here would speak up for her. The sounds around her went on like she wasn't part of them, but every glance that slid past made her feel the gap between being allowed to exist and being watched. Wade stayed where he was, hands on his hips like he was weighing his next move. Torrance looked at the lake, but his eyes still flicked toward Nadia. The kind of flicker that belonged to someone used to being in control, waiting for her to give him a reason. Nadia swallowed quietly. Not from fear, but because she could feel the afternoon starting to tip in the wrong direction. She just didn't know how far it was going to tilt. Wade stepped forward like he was walking onto land that belonged to him, and Torrance followed half a step behind, his eyes squinting at Nadia, as if she had just done something to offend them. Nadia kept her hand on the grill table, took a breath to steady her voice. Wade stopped right in front of her, so close that the stale cigarette smell on his shirt overpowered the scent of the food grilling. He asked bluntly, "Permit for this area? Where is it?" Nadia blinked lightly, because everyone who came to Woodlake knew this place didn't require that kind of document. She answered slowly and clearly, "I've been coming here for a long time. No one's ever asked for a permit." Wade narrowed his eyes, staring at her like he was searching for something to turn into a problem. Torrance stood slightly to the right, arms crossed, head tilted just enough to study her reaction. He cleared his throat, a crooked smile forming like his next question had no purpose except to stir trouble. Wade repeated the first question, but changed his tone, sharper now. I'll ask one more time. Where's the permit? Or do you like making trouble? Nadia's brow tightened slightly at the way his voice shifted. Her mind flashed to the crowded parking area behind her, the glances people had thrown her way before quickly looking off again, like they didn't want to get involved. She spoke again. I'm just grilling and waiting for my husband. No one here has ever asked for anything like that. Wade let out a dry laugh, the kind that didn't sound like laughter. More like a warning. I'm asking you, not them. That sentence hit like a hard knock on the invisible table between them, marking her position in his eyes. Torrance jumped in, his voice light but laced with mockery. Look around. Doesn't seem like anyone else has a problem but you. Nadia glanced at the two nearest families. They kept grilling and chatting, but each time her eyes met theirs, they looked away or pretended to focus on their food like they were trying to distance themselves from the whole thing. Nadia felt the weight of that silence, clearly the kind of silence people like her knew too well. Wade glanced over the grill, the picnic blanket, the SUV, then back to Nadia's face, like he was trying to find any excuse to keep her here longer. Where do you live? Nadia gave her address, doing her best to keep her voice steady. Wade curled his lip. Pretty far. Why drive all the way out here? Nadia answered with a patience that was wearing thin. I plan to meet my husband. We come here on weekends. Wade gave a short laugh, one that sounded like mockery. Interesting. People like you usually don't pick this place. Torrance watched the moment with barely hidden amusement. Maybe she's trying something new, he said, dragging out the end of his sentence like a deliberate provocation. Nadia looked straight at him. I don't understand what you mean. Torrance shrugged. I mean, this isn't a place where people are used to visitors like you. Nadia felt a heat rising in her chest, not fear, but the pressure of self-restraint being tested again and again. She knew if she reacted too strongly, they'd use that as an excuse. If she stayed silent, they'd take it as admission. She stood in between those two choices, holding her voice and her stance. Wade flicked the name tag on his chest, like a reminder that he had authority. Last time I'm asking, you bring trouble here or not? Nadia narrowed her eyes slightly. No, I came here like everyone else. Wade snorted, this time with a longer, nastier laugh. Everyone else. Look around. Do you see anyone here who looks like you? Nadia kept her breathing steady, the feeling all too familiar like thorns brushing bare skin. She asked back, her voice low and clear. What did I do wrong? Wade raised his hand, not touching her, but close enough to press. You make me suspicious. Torrance nodded, like he was confirming a fair conclusion. Nadia asked again. Suspicious of what? Wade answered, without hesitation. The way you act. Nadia stood still. I'm just standing here. Wade tilted his head. Exactly. And I see a problem. That made Torrance chuckle under his breath. I'm sure you've heard about all the stuff going on lately. We're just being careful. Nadia looked at the two men and wondered how many times they'd said things like that to people like her. Wade stared at her, like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. Just one, so he could take the next step. She looked around one last time. All the white families were still grilling, laughing, talking. No one else was being asked for a permit. No one was being stared down. No one had to explain why they were here. That contrast sat on her chest, like a stone, heavy, but familiar. Nadia took a deep breath and looked directly at Wade. I want to know the exact reason. Wade gave a thin smile. The sentence dropped into the space between them like a slap to her patience, turning the already tense air into something that could catch fire at any moment. Wade tilted his head slightly, then stepped in closer, now just a few inches from Nadia. His breath hit her face directly, thick with the stench of old cigarettes and bitter coffee, and she had to fight the reflex to pull back. He looked past her at the SUV, then down at her shoes, back up to her face, and dropped a question that sounded more like an accusation. "What are you doing with that expensive car rental, right?" The words rang out clear, like he was trying to split her dignity into two halves. One to insult, the other to crush. Nadia blinked slowly to stay calm. "It's mine." Wade gave a short, twisted laugh, clearly intentional. "Yeah, that's what they all say when they get stopped." He spoke like he'd dealt with dozens of people like her, and every answer was just another cheap joke to him. Torrance stood behind, slightly to the right, one hand on his hip like he was watching a small stage. He let out a light whistle, the kind that sounded like a signal between guys about to start something. "Careful, Wade. This type's always trouble." His voice wasn't loud, but Nadia caught every word underneath that familiar watch. Out for people like her tone she'd heard her whole life. She tightened her grip on the edge of the grill table, holding onto the calm she'd sharpened over years. Wade noticed. His eyes flickered with something close to amusement, as if her steadiness gave him more reason to push harder. He leaned in even more, close enough that Nadia could see the blue vein beneath the skin on his neck. "What are you really doing here?" Nadia answered, still calm, though her tone carried a trace of fatigue. "I told you. I'm waiting for my husband." Wade tilted his head and squinted, like he was listening to a lie. "Waiting for your husband? Or waiting for someone else?" The question dropped like a rock into water, sending ripples of insult just sharp enough to cut. Torrance chuckled behind her, the sound like a soda can popping open, except full of glee. Nadia turned her head briefly toward him, just long enough for him to lift his chin in a defiant challenge. Wade asked again, this time his voice low and slow. "What do you do for work?" Nadia answered truthfully, voice even. Wade raised an eyebrow and gave a crooked half-smile. "That job sounds fancy, but this car's a little much for your salary, don't you think?" The words weren't a question, but pure contempt disguised as one. Nadia felt a warm flush crawl up her neck, but she held it down. "I'm paying in installments." Wade laughed, like he'd just heard a fairy tale. "Yeah, they all say that." He repeated himself, but now his tone was heavier, more pointed. "Everybody says the car's theirs." "I know." Torrance stepped a bit closer, fingers tapping the strap across his chest. "Wade, better ask her real good. This kind always ends up in trouble." His eyes ran over Nadia with that same bare-faced judgment she'd seen in neighborhoods, shops, parking lots everywhere. Wendy, a woman standing at another grill just a few yards away, glanced over. But when Wade turned his head, she immediately looked down at her tray of meat, pretending she hadn't seen anything. Nadia noticed all of it, every tiny cue of silence from the people around her, every flicker of avoidance. And she understood. This wasn't a random check anymore. Wade straightened up again, resting his hand near the radio on his belt. The movement unhurried, but unmistakably intentional. "You sound like you're dodging." Nadia responded instantly, knowing silence at this point could be taken the wrong way. "I'm not dodging anything. If you have a question, ask it." Wade tilted his head. "I already did." "Whose car is this?" Nadia repeated. "It's mine." Torrance let out a dry chuckle. "Don't you get tired of hearing the same answer, Wade?" Wade kept his eyes locked on her face, not glancing away, not looking around, just standing close like that. "You know, places like this tend to get people causing trouble, breaking stuff, stealing things." Nadia answered right away. "I'm not that kind of person." Wade laughed out loud. "Everybody says that." Nadia realized that line was becoming his catchphrase, a sentence that meant nothing except to remind her that anything she said would automatically be taken as a lie. She asked, "What do you want me to do?" Wade raised his eyebrows. "Cooperate." Nadia looked him straight in the eye. "I am cooperating." Wade slowly leaned in closer, voice dropping to a level that sounded like a threat disguised as a whisper. You haven't seen what cooperating looks like yet? When he said that, Torrance laughed louder. A laugh that sounded like something being torn. Nadia felt a chill creep down her back, not from the weather, but from the survival instinct sounding its alarm. Wade continued, "What do you have in the car?" Nadia glanced at the SUV behind her. "Personal items." Wade stared at her for another couple of seconds, then said, "Open it." Nadia pressed her lips together briefly, because she knew exactly how far this had crossed the line of any legitimate check. Just as she was about to respond, Torrance threw in a line that felt like a barb. "If you're as clean as you say, what's there to be scared of when we look?" Nadia looked at the two men. Every word they spoke felt like a probe to see how much disrespect she could take before she pushed back. And in that moment, she understood something with complete clarity. This wasn't about paperwork or the vehicle. This was a test. A test men like Wade and Torrance ran on people like her in places like Woodlake. A test to see how low she would bow, how much she would swallow, how long she would stay quiet. And she felt that familiar ache rise in her chest, the kind that comes from knowing that whether you stay still or speak up. That ache told her this wasn't an inspection. This was a game, to see how much humiliation she'd endure before they decided to escalate things on their terms. Nadia tilted her head to the side to get a clearer read on Wade's expression, trying to see in his eyes what he was planning next. But the moment her face turned halfway, he lunged forward and grabbed her wrist with such force that her arm snapped toward him. It happened so fast that anyone nearby not looking directly would have thought she had done something to provoke the reaction. Wade yanked hard, causing Nadia's body to lurch forward. With the practiced motion of someone who had done this too many times before, he shoved her shoulder down, forcing her body face first toward the SUV. Her back hit the hood before she could catch her breath. The heat from the metal blasting against her chest and face like a first shock to the system. Nadia let out a cry, pained and startled, her voice catching. "What did I do wrong?" she asked, breath ragged, not begging, but trying to hold on to the last scrap of control. Wade didn't answer. One hand clamped tight around her wrist, the other pressed against her shoulder, forcing her down like he wanted to fuse her to the car. The tendons in his arm bulged, his breath heavy and close, as if this act of force brought him some kind of satisfaction. Nadia tried to turn her face, but the hot metal forced her to grit her teeth. The sounds around the campsite seemed to drop away, leaving only her own pounding breath and the scrape of Wade's shoes shifting on the dirt as he adjusted his grip. He muttered through clenched teeth, low enough that only she could hear, "Don't move." It wasn't a procedural command, it was a threat dressed up in authority. Torrance stood just behind them, hands on his hips like he was watching a performance that entertained him. He let out a short laugh, and it sent a chill down Nadia's spine. "Relax, lady. Don't make a scene." His voice was smug, like the real offense was her existing in this space at all. "I know your kind," he added, dragging out the last word like a small blade slicing across her ear. Nadia bit her lip to keep from responding. She heard every word, each one like a shard of bias aimed straight at her. Wade squeezed her wrist tighter and twisted her arm behind her back. The motion, quick, precise, the kind they'd practiced 100 times, but now laced with punishment. Pain shot through her joint, sharp enough that she had to clamp her jaw to stop herself from crying out. Ethan had once told her this kind of hold, if done with too much force, could pop a joint out of place. That thought made her breathe harder, doing everything she could to keep her balance and not collapse completely onto the hood. Wade snapped the cuffs shut. The metallic clink hit like punctuation in the moment. As the lock clicked, Nadia's wrist turned red instantly, her skin burning where metal met flesh, the pain and numbness racing up her arm. A few people nearby looked over, but their eyes quickly slid away, like they'd just seen something best ignored. At the lake, Adults nudged children deeper into the water. Conversations dipped for a few seconds, then resumed as if nothing had happened. Nadia felt it clearly, the cloak of invisibility being thrown over her. The same silence that so many carried when injustice unfolded in plain view. Wade yanked the cuffs higher, lifting her arms and pulling her body upward until her shoulders tightened in pain. "I said don't move," he repeated, this time louder, voice filled with warning. Nadia gasped, not from panic, but because the sudden pull strained her muscles to the point of agony. "I'm not resisting," she said through clenched teeth. Wade didn't care. He shifted position and shoved her sideways to get a better grip on both wrists. "Clearly, you like causing problems." Nadia turned her face slightly to catch her breath, but Wade's stare pushed her right back where he wanted her. Torrance shook his head, voice soaked in condescension. "Told you, Wade. This type always comes with trouble." Nadia heard every syllable, every ounce of contempt, every baseless accusation they threw at her. Shame rose up inside her, but she didn't let it break the surface. Her silence gave them more reason to treat her like something they could mold and control. Wade pressed his thumb against the edge of her cuff, right where the metal dug into her wrist, sending a fresh bolt of pain through her like a jolt of electricity. "You think I'm joking?" Nadia forced her voice to stay firm. "I didn't do anything," Wade snapped back, voice slicing the air. "You make me suspicious." "That's enough." Suspicious, the word echoed in Nadia's mind, like a familiar bell. The reason they always gave to justify what they did to people like her. Torrance stepped in half a pace, leaning to get a good look at her face pinned against the car. "Wade, looks like this one's real stubborn." Wade let out a dry laugh, the kind of sound that scraped across the air like the worst noise Nadia had ever endured. "We'll see how stubborn she really is." He yanked the cuffs again, just enough to make her knees buckle slightly. She tried to hold her balance, her cuffed hands trembling with pain, and yet one thing was clear to her. This blow, this moment was just the beginning of what they intended to unload on her, in a place where they believed no one cared enough to stop them. When Wade pulled her arms higher, the sharp pain shot from her wrist to her shoulder blade, and Nadia felt the cold truth settle into her mind. They weren't using the law. They were using bias, reflex, the instincts of men who believed they were the center of power. And here she was, caught in the middle of it, hurting, but still holding on to the last piece of her dignity, refusing to be completely broken. Wade gripped Nadia's wrist with one hand, while the other reached into her handbag and yanked everything out with more force than necessary. Her wallet was pulled open, her phone dropped onto the grass, and a water bottle rolled before stopping near the tire. Wade bent down to pick up the wallet, flipping it over like he was examining a knockoff in a cheap store. "Designer bag?" "Huh? Bet? It's fake." He said it loudly enough for nearby people to hear, his tone soaked in the judgment of someone convinced they could sum her up by her skin and her purse. He shook the handbag again, harder this time, and a few small items fell to the ground, which he kicked aside like they were worthless. Nadia clenched her teeth. The pressure from the cuffs made her shoulder ache, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just waiting for my husband." The words came out on a tight breath, but not a shaky one. Wade looked at her, raising his eyebrows like her answer was a joke. Torrance, standing close by, cleared his throat and let out a loud laugh, the kind that dragged on like he'd just heard the funniest story all day. "Oh, let me guess. He's working the night shift at a gas station." He tossed the words out with smug delight, dragging her and the man she mentioned into the lazy stereotypes he carried around like currency. Nadia bit her lip at that, part from pain, part from the humiliation being forced down her throat with no way to push back. She didn't scream, she didn't explain. She knew anything she said now would be twisted into an excuse. Wade kept rummaging through her wallet aggressively before looking up, locking eyes with her with a smug look. I'll ask again. Where's your husband? Nadia replied with a thin breath. On his way. Wade let out a short laugh. Yeah. Let's see what kind of man he turns out to be. A family at the nearby picnic table was walking past. The man glanced over, his eyes pausing for half a second on the handcuffs around Nadia's wrists and Wade's hand rifling through her wallet. The woman beside him tugged on his arm and whispered something. They both lowered their heads and walked faster, like they needed to get away from the space where the truth might make them uncomfortable. Nadia caught that moment, just a flash, but it stayed with her. Their silence weighed just as heavy as Wade's words and Torrance's laughter. Wade kept digging until he pulled out her car key. He held it up to eye level, turning it in his hand like he was assessing the value. Nice car. Who'd you borrow it from? Nadia stared at him, her voice flat from restraint. I already told you. Wade cut her off. I don't believe you. The satisfaction in his tone was plain. Like every word she said gave him more reason to look down on her. Torrance stood closer now, leaning against the car, eyes fixed on Nadia, like she was the entertainment for an otherwise boring afternoon. Nadia felt her shoulders straining from the cuffs. Every small movement sent a sting down her wrists. Wade noticed her discomfort. Instead of easing off, he tugged the cuffs slightly upward, forcing her shoulders down even more. I'm talking to you and you keep dodging. Nadia answered quietly, but clearly. I'm not dodging. Wade snorted out a laugh. A short sound that made Torrance chuckle with him, both of them sharing a look of agreement. That attitude's familiar, Wade said, tapping the side of the car while facing Nadia. Acting like you're better than everyone, then crying when you get checked. Nadia wanted to turn her head away, but the heat from the car hood made her keep still. Her personal belongings were scattered around Wade's feet, each item, like a piece of her life, tossed to the ground and stomped on with their stares. Every word they said landed in her chest like a blow, squeezing the breath out of her. She heard a boy's footsteps running nearby, before a mother yanked him back. Don't look, she whispered, and that line cut through louder than anything else. Wade finally bent down, grabbed the wallet, and tossed it back into the bag with such disrespect that Nadia had to clench her jaw to stop a sound from escaping. He stood up, dusted off his hands, then looked her up and down one more time. Waiting on your husband, huh? Let's see if he shows up in time. Torrance threw in a line that made both of them laugh. Probably somewhere counting change. Nadia took a sharp breath. Not from exhaustion, but from the fury buried so deep it felt like her chest might explode. She knew this afternoon wasn't close to over. And whatever they were doing now was just the beginning. Not a single person in the campground had stepped up, said a word, or taken a step toward her. Every one of them had chosen to look away, leaving Nadia standing there with bruised wrists and her dignity ripped apart in plain sight under the fading light. Wade bent down and picked up Nadia's phone from the patch of grass where he'd kicked it earlier while searching her bag. The screen was still lit, showing the message she had sent to Ethan right before everything turned bad. Wade glanced at the screen, then at her face, lips curling into a crooked smile like he had just found one more thing to drag her down with. Nadia looked at him from where she stood cuffed, wrists throbbing in rhythm with her pulse, and said something she knew would provoke him, but she had no other choice. Call my husband. Her voice was raspy but steady, carrying exhaustion, pain, and a deep trust in the man who was on his way, though she didn't know if he'd arrive in time. Wade raised an eyebrow, slowly turning the phone between two fingers like he wasn't holding someone else's property, but holding power. Call him? Sure, he said, smirking as he stared her down. Then he added, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, I'd love to see who thinks they can save you. Each word dragged like gravel across stone, not a trace of goodwill, only the thrill of a challenge, as if the man she mentioned was nothing more than a name to test. He pressed the call button with his thumb, deliberately firm, like he was proving he controlled everything on this patch of grass. The line barely rang twice before the call was answered. There was no background noise, no hesitation, no fumbling. Just a man's voice, deep, clear, sharp as a blade fresh from the whetstone. "This is Ethan Evans. Who's holding my wife's phone?" The sentence landed clean and hard enough to make the skin at Nadia's neck go cold. Wade, who had towered over her all afternoon, paused for just 1 second. A tiny second, but enough for his swagger to dip like he'd just stepped on something he hadn't meant to. Torrance looked over at Wade, frowning slightly like he was silently asking, "What's going on?" But Wade raised a hand to signal for quiet. He took a shallow breath, then spoke again, trying to maintain his usual dominant tone. Your wife is causing trouble here. I need to check things out." The words fell flat, noticeably weaker next to the voice coming through the speaker. Nadia stayed silent, chest aching with each breath. But her eyes locked onto Wade, tracking every small shift in his face. The ones he tried to hide, but didn't manage fast enough. She knew his type too well. When he thought someone was beneath him, the words came easy. But the moment he faced someone who made him hesitate, his tone changed just half a note. But it always changed. Ethan let him finish, then replied with a voice that needed no volume, no force, no emphasis. "Give me the location." Wade's brow creased slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct demand. "Like I said, she's being—" Ethan cut in, calm but sharp enough to freeze Torrance's grin. "I didn't ask what she's doing. I asked for the location." Nadia heard it. Her heart tightened through the pain. Wade glanced around, like he needed time to recover his footing. But Ethan spoke again crisp, leaving no space for evasion. "Location. Right now. In the stun." A short silence fell over them, sharp enough to make the sound of wind brushing through the grass audible. Wade turned halfway to Torrance, the flicker in his eyes too small for anyone else. But Torrance understood something had shifted. Nadia saw both of them, her gaze sharpening even as her body ached. The change in atmosphere was unmistakable, like a sky torn open by sudden wind. Wade squinted and looked back at the phone, like he was weighing whether to back down or protect his pride. But Ethan didn't let him stall. "I'm tracking the signal. If you want to explain, I'm listening. If not, I'll be there in 2 minutes." Torrance took half a step back. Wade swallowed, and his voice, once loud and aggressive, lost its bite. "Who are you?" Ethan replied like a steel wire tightening around a throat. "The husband you're disrespecting." Nadia watched Wade, and saw it the slight tremble in his hand, even though he tried to keep his expression blank. That shift was the first crack in the long afternoon. A sign that the power these two had relied on wasn't standing quite as firm anymore. Wade turned slightly, took a deep breath like he was trying to gather what was left of his bravado. "Fine. Come then." But his words lacked force, lacked the threat he usually carried. Ethan answered instantly, not leaving a gap. "Make sure my wife stays exactly as she is." Wade opened his mouth to say something else, but Ethan ended the call. That sharp, final act left Wade frozen for a few seconds, then slowly lowering the phone. Slower than he'd raised it. Nadia stood there, wrists in pain, but her eyes no longer low like they had been at the start. She looked at Wade. She looked at Torrance, and she felt the field around them shift. Not because the sun was setting, but because the balance of power between them had just cracked. Wade looked at her again, but this time his eyes weren't full of pure disdain. There was something else. Something like doubt. Like the question of whether he had gone too far with the wrong person. Torrance broke the silence with a low voice, just loud enough for Wade to hear. "Wade, this might not be simple." Wade clenched his hand slightly, then turned to Nadia. His voice wasn't sharp anymore, but he still tried to sound firm. "Who exactly is your husband?" Nadia let out a shallow breath and answered slowly, every word scraping through sore lips. "You're about to find out." The sound of engines echoed across the lake, like muffled drums, before bursting into 3 gusts of wind as 3 black SUVs veered onto the grass. Families grilling nearby turned around in alarm, some standing up outright at the sight of the vehicles, which clearly weren't from the local patrol. Wade spun around on instinct, his hand brushing his holster before pulling back as the glare of light off the SUV hoods hit his eyes. The CIEU logo came into view on the car doors as they opened, the kind of insignia every police officer knew not to mess with. Torrance froze, one foot twitching slightly like the ground had just tilted beneath him. Ethan stepped out of the lead vehicle, the black suit fitting his frame like it had been tailored just for him. He didn't need to say a word for the air to tighten. His eyes scanned the area once before, locking instantly on Nadia's cuffed wrists and the red swelling on her skin. Wade tilted his head slightly, exhaled, and let his hand fall away from the weapon at his side in a motion that looked like someone had pulled a string. Ethan walked toward Nadia, each step steady and controlled. Not rushed, but carrying enough weight to silence every half-finished conversation in the area. Nadia lifted her chin slightly as Ethan approached. Her body was exhausted from being restrained so long, but her gaze didn't falter. Ethan leaned down, lifting her cuffed wrist gently with 2 fingers as if afraid of causing her more pain. The cold of his touch against the hot swelling made Nadia's breath slow. He turned her wrist slightly to check the other side. His face didn't change, but his jaw locked into a hard line. He spoke a short sentence to the nearest CIRU agent, so brief Wade couldn't hear it. But he understood it wasn't meant for him. The agent nodded, and immediately pulled out the cuff release kit. When the cuff snapped open, the soft click was quieter than anything Nadia had heard all afternoon. But it was the only sound that let her shoulders begin to relax. Ethan lowered her wrist with care, then looked directly into her face to make sure she was all right, at least as much as anyone could be in that moment. Nadia said nothing. Her eyes held his gaze for a few seconds, like they both knew what she had just endured couldn't be summed up with a simple, "Are you okay?" Ethan turned to Wade, his eyes leaving Nadia, but the chill in them just as sharp. A cold that made Wade's whole body tense, even as he tried to stand tall. The entire lawn seemed to freeze as Ethan made a half-circle toward Wade. Wade opened his mouth to say something that might have been an excuse, but the words caught in his throat when Ethan stopped in front of him without needing to raise his voice. It was the exact opposite of the arrogance Wade had shown all day. 2 CIRU agents stood behind Ethan, without drawing weapons or issuing commands, but their presence alone made Torrance take a half-step back in reflex. Wade glanced around and swallowed hard, trying to look calm, though the pulse in his neck was visibly pounding. Nadia slowly stood taller now that her wrists were free. She rolled her shoulders slightly to ease the muscle tension. Her hand still trembled a bit as she adjusted her pink blazer, but her movements were precise. Her gaze lifted gradually and landed directly on Wade, deep and clear enough that he had to look away. Just for a flicker of a second he couldn't hide. Nadia didn't speak, didn't yell or cry. But in that look was something Wade understood better than any insult. It wasn't hate. It was memory, a silent record being kept, heavy and permanent, forcing him to confront exactly what he had done. Ethan stood next to her, the distance between them discreet, but close enough to make it clear to anyone watching where his protection lay. 1 CIRU agent stepped forward with antiseptic wipes for Nadia to clean the marks left by the cuffs. Wade remained where he was, still pretending he had the right to offer an explanation, but unable to say a word under the weight of every stare from the CIRU team, which made it clear he was no longer in control of the situation. Torrance stared at the ground, his head bowed as if afraid that lifting it would be enough to implicate himself further. The sky over the lake had shifted to a lighter yellow as the sun dropped. But the chill in the air wasn't from weather. It came from the reversal of power playing out in front of them. Nadia touched the red mark on her wrist, stung but steady, still standing tall, still focused on Wade. Ethan glanced at her for a moment, his eyes silently asking if she was all right, then returned to the cold expression of a man who had seen countless confrontations but had never let the woman he loved endure humiliation like this. That moment blanketed the whole field in silence, so complete that even the soft thump of a small sail hitting its mast on the lake could be heard. Wade took a half-step back. Torrance looked around like he was searching for someone to take his side. But everyone had gone back to their grills, avoiding his eyes like avoiding a stain spreading through the air. Nadia took a deep breath, steadying her voice as she spoke one short sentence to Wade. "You should take a look at what you just did." That single line made Wade's shoulders tighten and turned the entire course of the afternoon in a direction he never saw coming. One of the CIRU agents stepped forward, pulled out the investigation warrant, and read the authority rights aloud on the spot, his voice clear and firm enough to freeze Wade and Torrance in place. Without raising his tone or making threats, he held out his hand toward the two officers. "Hand over your weapons." The entire campsite seemed to hold its breath as Wade looked around, searching for something to cling to, but no one dared to speak. No one wanted to be involved. Wade drew his gun from the holster more slowly than usual, his fingers slightly trembling, and handed it over to the agent with a motion that was both reluctant and confused. Torrance moved faster, but his eyes kept darting around, as if looking for an escape route. The CIRU agent checked the serial numbers, the safeties, and placed both firearms into sealed evidence bags. His actions were so methodical and practiced that there was no doubt this situation had already escalated far beyond the control of two small-town officers. Wade swallowed hard, then stammered, the words catching in his throat. I didn't know who she was." It didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like a confession that accidentally exposed what he truly thought. Ethan stood right beside Nadia, every line on his face cold enough to make anyone instinctively take a half-step back, without him needing to show anger. "That's the problem," Ethan replied, his voice low and even, not emphasizing any words, but with enough weight to make the truth hit like a heavy object. "You didn't want to know." Wade looked at Ethan, then at Nadia. His face went a shade paler, like he was only just now realizing how badly he had stepped into something far beyond him. As the weapons were sealed away, another agent stepped out from the second CIRU vehicle. His name tag indicated he was from internal security. He looked at Nadia, then glanced down at the device in his hand, which was already displaying her profile. "She's flagged. High alert tracking." That line made both Wade and Torrance blink, clearly not understanding anything happening beyond the tiny circle of control they thought they had. Ethan turned his head to the agent. "Since when?" The other responded immediately. "Several weeks. Maybe longer." Nadia's shoulders twitched slightly, not from pain, but because the information hit something she had sensed before, but didn't want to believe. Wade shrank back into silence, clearly unable to comprehend why someone he had thought so little of was now marked in the federal system. The internal security agent swept his eyes across Nadia's camping setup, then signaled to two CIRU team members to thoroughly inspect all the bags, coolers, and compartments in the vehicle. They moved with quiet precision, opening each item, checking every layer, logging every position. Nadia stood beside Ethan, her wrist still sore, but her mind now focused in one direction. The same intuition that had been keeping her awake at night was now surging forward. The third agent unzipped her large camping bag, slipped his hand under the inner lining, and in an instant, his fingers stopped. He pulled out a small object, about the size of a thumb, wrapped in smooth black plastic, with a USB port clearly exposed at one end, making it stand out in the fading afternoon light. "Got something," he said, holding the small item up at Ethan's eye level. Wade leaned in, squinting, while Torrance lagged a second behind, trying to figure out if the item was significant. Ethan took the USB between two fingers, turning it in his palm like someone far too familiar with such devices in sensitive investigations. "From her bag?" he asked. The agent confirmed with a nod. Nadia looked at the USB, her expression changing slowly, not surprised, but as if something she'd tried to dismiss had now been confirmed. She took a soft breath, her eyes locked on the small object, like it had just opened a door she knew wouldn't close easily. Ethan turned to Nadia, his voice dropping another level. "When did you put this here?" Nadia didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at her camping bag, then around the area where her gear had been scattered by Wade and Torrance. "I didn't put it there." Ethan paused for half a second, long enough to realize that what was unfolding wasn't just about cops abusing authority, but about others in the shadows, people who had the means to access her personal equipment. The internal security agent typed a few lines into the device. "The data on the USB is heavily encrypted, federal level." Wade looked from one person to another, his eyes completely blank, the pit of his stomach tightening as he realized he'd stepped into something far beyond what he imagined when he decided to harass a black woman standing alone. Torrance stared at the USB, then turned to Wade, looking for the first time like someone who had just realized they had stepped on something far out of their reach. Nadia looked at both of them, and her gaze was no longer the pain of someone humiliated, but the sharp clarity of someone who knew another storm was coming from behind, one far stronger than the two men who had just slammed her onto a car hood. Ethan closed the USB drive and handed it to the agent. "Seal it." Then he turned to Wade, his voice not loud, but sharp enough to make Wade snap upright out of instinct. "This story is no longer about you. It's bedded in the sides." Wade took a deep breath and stepped back slightly. And for the first time all afternoon, he had no words. Nadia stood in the middle of the grass, wrists still red. But her eyes didn't leave the USB, even after it was sealed in the evidence bag. She knew clearly that the confrontation everyone had just witnessed was only the surface of something much larger, something that had crept into her life before she had time to face it. And Ethan had known that from the moment he saw the mark on her wrist, the moment he saw the USB appear in a place it didn't belong. Another battle was about to begin. Not one of fists and force, but of a power much deeper, much darker. A brief silence stood between them and the CIRU team. Not the heavy silence like when Wade was yelling at Nadia, but a different kind of quiet. The kind that signals a turning point both of them knew would be hard to face. The internal security agent stood a few steps away, holding the sealed evidence bag with the USB, occasionally glancing at Nadia as if trying to piece together the fragments of a story. Ethan looked at the bag, then turned his eyes directly to his wife. They no longer held the sharpness he had shown when confronting the two officers earlier, but a different kind of cold one that comes from realizing you don't really know the person standing in front of you. "You kept this from me?" Ethan asked. His voice wasn't raised, wasn't heavy, but there was a thin edge under every word. Nadia didn't look down or away. She stood straight despite the pain in her wrist, her breathing steady again after being pressed down against the car hood. She had known this question would come, had known Ethan wouldn't avoid asking what he needed to know. But what she wasn't sure of was whether he was ready to hear the real answer. "I didn't keep it from you," Nadia said slowly, each word deliberate. "I just didn't tell you." Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, like he was trying to spot the fine line between those two sentences and figure out where the truth lived. But Nadia kept speaking before he could ask more. "I don't trust anyone." In Destun, Ethan stayed still for half a second, just long enough for the entire CIRU team to sense the shift in the air. It wasn't tense in the way Wade had made it tense. It was the tension of two people who had shared a home, now confronting something they had avoided for far too long. Nadia said it with such bluntness that Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly, like the words had hit a place he thought had long since healed. But it was the next sentence that threw the entire moment off balance. "Not even you," Nadia added, still looking him in the eye. "Especially not after what happened 2 years ago." Ethan went still for a beat so noticeable that even Torrance and Wade, standing several steps away, could feel the change in his posture. 2 years ago, a phrase no one else here understood, but it carried enough weight to shift the atmosphere of the field entirely. Ethan parted his lips slightly, as if to push back with a short reply, but his throat caught halfway, and he closed his mouth again. In that moment, the man who had just made 2 local officers back off, who had arrived in 3 black SUVs, stood frozen, as if every word Nadia had just said was playing back a scene he didn't want to face. The internal security agent glanced over, eyebrows drawn slightly but kept silent, knowing this wasn't the time to step in. The other CIRU agents also stayed quiet, their eyes not looking directly, but all of them aware. Something was breaking inside the calm stare Ethan had held for too long. Nadia looked at him for a long second. Long enough to see a shift in her husband's expression she hadn't seen when he stepped out of the car, hadn't seen when he confronted Wade, hadn't seen when he gave the order to disarm. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan looked like a man facing the truth, not a federal agent managing a situation. Nadia rotated her wrist. The burn was still there, but that pain was nothing compared to what she had just forced herself to say out loud. "I've been doing this for a long time," Nadia said, her voice lower but still clear. "And since 2 years ago, I've handled everything on my own." That sentence made Ethan's shoulders drop by half an inch. A small shift, like the instinctive flinch of someone hit where they weren't ready. "Because back then, I saw you choose to believe the system over a victim." Ethan looked at her for a long time, so long that Nadia had to draw in a thin breath to stop herself from slipping into a defensive stance. He didn't speak, though his lips moved slightly, as if trying to rewrite the story. But knowing this wasn't the time. One of the CIRU agents standing behind Ethan, the oldest in the group, glanced sideways, then respectfully looked away, recognizing a boundary that had just been cracked open at the worst possible moment, but one that cut to the heart of a shared life. Wade stood just a few steps away, watching everything unfold with no understanding beyond the fact that the man he had challenged just minutes ago was now facing a problem that had nothing to do with files or authority. Nadia's tone didn't change, didn't soften after what she said. "That's why I didn't tell you. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't know if you'd be on my side when things got bad." Ethan took a deep breath, but still said nothing, and that silence made the truth clearer than any explanation ever could. The pain in Nadia's wrists had eased, but the weight pressing on her chest had not. She knew she was right. She knew Ethan understood every word she had just said. That crack hadn't formed today. It had only just been brought into the light. The CIRU team didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, because even they could see that what was unfolding in front of them had moved beyond protocol and into the deeply human space between 2 people, still standing side by side, but with a distance that felt impossible to measure. Ethan finally let out a long breath, not to find relief, but like he was acknowledging a truth he had tried to seal away for 2 years. "I heard you." He spoke slowly, his voice catching for just one beat. Nadia kept her eyes on his face, her expression unchanged. Ethan turned slightly toward the agent holding the sealed bag, then spoke in a low tone, his voice steadier now, the professional composure returning but still showing signs of a fracture beneath. "Give me the preliminary report." He looked away from Nadia for just 1 second, and that second was enough for her to realize that the crack had shown itself in front of his entire team, something he had never let happen before. And in that moment, she understood that what happened today hadn't just shaken the authority of 2 police officers, it had shaken the foundation of a marriage she and Ethan had spent so long trying to keep balanced. A CIRU agent had just walked off to examine the device when Nadia leaned closer to Ethan. Her voice was low but clear, not a tremble in it despite the pain in her wrist. "Wade didn't act on his own," she said, each word pulling the entire field into a deeper register. Ethan turned to her, his eyes sharpening by instinct. Nadia looked directly at the USB drive sealed in the evidence bag and continued, "Someone's trying to track black women in the federal system. I saw the markers in the data 3 weeks ago." That line made the internal security agent look up, and Ethan's shoulders stiffened slightly. Wade, standing a few steps away, widened his eyes. He didn't understand half of what was being said, but the feeling that he was just an expendable pawn became as clear as if someone had just torn open a curtain he never knew was there. Another agent approached Ethan and handed him a phone. "The video's online," he said, urgent but calm. Ethan took it, eyes sweeping across the screen. Nadia knew what she was about to see, but even so, when the images came up, the air around her shifted. The moment Wade yanked her arm, slammed her face against the car hood, the clink of hot metal rang out, and Torrance's voice echoed clearly. "Calm down, lady. I know your type." Laughter in the background. Her strangled breath when her wrist was twisted. The shot of Wade, rifling through her belongings, like tearing through someone's dignity. All of it. Caught in frame, no edits, no cuts. The video hit the platform within minutes, then jumped to thousands of shares in a single breath. One agent behind them muttered, almost unconsciously, "It's spreading 10 times faster than the other cases." Ethan looked at Nadia, but she didn't look back. Her eyes were on the patch of grass where she'd been pinned. "Because it happened again," she said quietly. "And people are tired." Over by the field, a few locals had just watched the video on their phones. Their faces tightened. Some stared at her for a few seconds longer, like they were witnessing something shifting in real time, but no one stepped forward. Their silence felt like a boulder dropped between two worlds. A group of young black men from nearby Foster had reposted the video with the caption, "Again?" And within minutes, it became the phrase repeated under hundreds of different posts. People who had lived through similar moments started commenting, from mothers to men wrongly pulled over. They were all saying the same thing. "This happens all the time. They don't need a reason." Nadia stood in the middle of that spiral, unmoving, silent, but her eyes looked farther away now, as if she were seeing hundreds of unfamiliar faces reflected in her own moment. Ethan's phone kept vibrating with dozens of calls from the office, but it was another call that caught Nadia's attention. The screen showed an unknown number, no name saved. A CIRU agent handed it to her. "Incoming call for Nadia Evans." Ethan reached to take it, but Nadia raised her hand and held his gaze. "I'm listening." The voice on the other end was deep, slightly rough, and carried the weight of someone who had told too much truth for too many people's comfort. "This is Martin Crest, Eastern Region NAACP. Your story matches a file I've been tracking for 3 years." Nadia froze for half a beat. She knew that name, knew the investigations he had pushed, knew he was the force behind lawsuits that had made state police departments publicly admit wrongdoing. "How long have you known about this?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Martin answered right away. "No detour. We got the video 2 minutes ago. Someone sent it with a note saying, 'This matches the pattern from Lexington, Monroe, and Haven Ridge.'" Nadia swallowed a tight breath when she heard those 3 names. They were all cases involving black women in federal agencies being tracked or harassed under so-called random checks that were later proven to be targeted. Martin continued, "I have a file on a unit inside local law enforcement used to test reactions from people like you. I'm not saying everyone's involved, but Wade and Torrance aren't outliers." Ethan stood right next to her, hearing every word, his jaw tightening with each confirmation of what had been growing in his gut since the USB appeared. Martin asked, "Are you safe?" Nadia scanned the field, saw Wade standing farther back, his face draining shade by shade, saw the CIRU team forming a small perimeter around her, then answered, "I'm safe." But she knew that was only temporary. Martin took a breath and said, "We need to talk soon. This video's going to explode. And I think you've touched something bigger than a case of abuse of power." Nadia looked at the USB, her eyes tightening like glass under pressure. "I know," she said, "because Wade wasn't targeting me. Someone pushed him toward me." Ethan heard that, and even though he stood inches away, it felt like a part of the field split in two between the truth just spoken and the long silence they had both been living inside. The sky dimmed by half a shade, and Nadia understood one thing with full clarity. The video was just the fuse, not the bomb. The real bomb was why it happened. And that, she knew, was bigger than the humiliation she had endured this afternoon. The Woodlake County Police Department held a rushed press conference the next morning, thrown together so quickly that some reporters didn't even have time to set up their full equipment. The media lieutenant stood at the podium, reading from a prepared statement in a flat, mechanical voice. Officer Wade acted in accordance with protocol, based on on-site suspicion. All further steps will be handled internally. No one believed that, not even the man reading it. His face was tight, like someone forced to swallow a story he knew wasn't true. When a reporter asked, "Why was only Nadia searched?" he flipped a page and dodged the question with a generic reply. "We encourage everyone to wait for the findings." The statement felt like a flimsy patch, so thin you could see the cracks through it. The video kept spreading. The more it spread, the more the department's clarification looked like a joke. Martin Crest, from the Eastern Region NAACP office, called a press briefing that same night. He placed a thick folder on the table, each page marked with a date. 12 incidents in 3 years. Same county, same approach, same group of officers. He said it straight to the camera and to a few local lawmakers. He opened each file, presenting each case, his voice steady and slow. But every word carried weight. The women in these cases mostly work for federal agencies or have family who do. That's the pattern. A reporter raised a hand. "Do you have proof this was racially targeted?" Martin didn't blink. "I have statistics." He turned the screen. Every single victim was a black woman. The internet did the rest. Within hours, Wade's record surfaced. A phrase started appearing across multiple posts. "Clean sheet, that's too clean." Almost everyone understood what it meant. Wade had 4 prior complaints for discriminatory conduct, 2 incidents involving excessive force during stops, and 1 community report for public verbal abuse. All of them were wiped from his record within 2 weeks of being filed. "Weird, huh?" One account wrote. "An officer with that many complaints and still getting promoted every year?" Another reposted a still from the video, captioned, "No one behaves like that by accident. This is a pattern." Another race. Nadia read the comments from her living room. Her phone kept buzzing journalists, strangers sending messages of outrage or saying they understood because they had lived through something similar. Nadia didn't feel proud of that. She didn't want to be a symbol or a headline for a story she had spent years trying to stay out of. She stared at the freeze frame in the article, her face pressed to the hood of the car, wrists red from the cuffs, and Wade standing behind her. That wasn't the image she wanted anyone to picture when they heard her name. Ethan walked in holding Ciru's preliminary report. "Media's asking if you want to make a statement." Nadia didn't look away from the screen. "No." Ethan sat down beside her, speaking softly. "You have the right to tell your story your way." Nadia shook her head gently. "I don't want to be a famous victim. I want this to be investigated properly, not turned into weekend commentary. Ethan didn't reply. He knew she was right. Public anger flares fast but fades just as quickly, while the systems that protect men like Wade have been rooted in place for years. The phone buzzed again. A message from Martin. PD just sent out a second PIO unit for another press conference. They're prepping a new angle. I'm guessing they'll say you were uncooperative. Nadia exhaled hard. They always do. Martin replied instantly. We won't let them get away with that. I'm going public with all 12 cases. Get ready for political pressure. Nadia set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her mind still reeling like a current that hadn't stopped flowing since yesterday afternoon. Her life had been quiet, private, always careful to stay out of the spotlight. Now it had been torn open, all because she stood alone on a lawn one afternoon. Outside, a few reporters were posted at the curb, cameras pointed toward her house. Some neighbors looked over, then quickly turned away, just like at the campground, unwilling to pick a side. Nadia recognized that look. It was so familiar, it made her chest tighten. No one wants to get involved when it comes to the police. People would rather stay silent than get pulled into trouble. That silence, she thought, is exactly what allows men like Wade to grow. She turned her bruised wrist. The sting was still there. It reminded her that what was happening wasn't because she was weak, but because others assumed she would be. Nadia Evans, victim of police violence, was the line printed in most headlines, but she didn't see herself in those words. Ethan stood at the doorway, watching her for a long moment, then asked, "Do you want to walk away from this?" Nadia didn't answer right away. She looked at the USB on the table, sealed, small, black, and silent but heavy as lead. "No," she finally said, "because if I walk away, people like me will keep being pushed into this. And those 12 names will be forgotten, like they never existed." Nadia didn't want to be the center of it all, but she knew this eruption wasn't going to stop. She hadn't chosen this role, but for the first time, she understood that staying out of it wouldn't save her either. The wave had come, and she had no choice now but to stand in it. Inside CIRU headquarters, the emergency meeting between the investigative unit and IA representatives was so tense, no one dared to breathe too loudly. The report from Woodlake County sat on the table, along with the full video and the USB awaiting decryption. One IA representative claimed it was a misinterpreted patrol incident, while a CIRU agent responded with a tone that bordered on sarcastic. Then how do you explain only checking one person? Neither side backed down. Every sentence felt like a needle poking through the thin fabric of an already fraying internal system. Data charts lit up on the wall. Numbers showing similar cases in the county appeared, and the room sank into the kind of silence that only exists in places where people know they're trying to cover something far too big to hide. Ethan stood at the far end of the table, watching IA representatives argue over something that never should have been up for debate. A mid-level IA officer approached him during the break, not making direct eye contact, only lowering his head slightly and speaking in a near whisper. "Wade's protected. Since last year." Ethan didn't respond right away, but his eyes darkened. The officer continued, his voice nearly inaudible. "He's dodged charges 3 times thanks to the same guy. That guy sits on the disciplinary board." With that, he stepped back, disappearing into the flow of people exiting the room as if he had never been there. Ethan stayed frozen for a long moment, both hands pressed against the edge of the table, his back slightly arched from the weight of realizing what he'd ignored all afternoon in Woodlake. This was no longer just about his wife being abused by the system. This was about something with deeper roots, connected to a network of protectors, to calls he hadn't yet heard, but knew had already been made. Ethan stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall for a few seconds to steady his breathing. The pressure in his chest wasn't from the job, it was from realizing the story Nadia had told him the night before, about what happened 2 years ago, wasn't just a crack in their marriage. It was a warning he hadn't wanted to see. A CIRU agent passed by and handed him an updated file. Nadia really is a DHS contractor. The tracking request came from a third party, not internal. No name on the signed order. Ethan clenched the file in his hand, a chill running through his fingers like an exposed wire. The truth was getting closer, but so was the danger. While Ethan tried to piece things together, Nadia's phone buzzed in the temporary apartment they were using to avoid the press. She unlocked the screen, expecting it to be Martin or another agent. But what she read made her grip the phone hard enough to feel pain in her wrist again. A message from an unknown number. No profile photo. No saved name. Stop. I don't want to see you disappear. Nadia sat on the edge of the bed, the glow from the screen lighting her face, exposing a layer of worry she had forced herself to swallow the day before. I don't want to see you disappear wasn't a normal warning. It carried the scent of someone who had seen this happen before, someone who knew what happened to people with names like hers. Ethan stepped into the room and immediately noticed the change in her face. He moved closer, voice low. Who sent that? Nadia handed him the phone. Ethan read the message, and his expression turned to steel. How long ago? Nadia answered softly. Just now. Ethan folded the phone shut and placed it on the table. Don't reply. Don't delete. Let me feed it into the system. Nadia looked at him, her eyes tightening. Ethan, is there someone else besides Wade? Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared at the black screen, then looked back at his wife, realizing this question couldn't be answered with reassurance. Looks like there is. The CIRU team reconvened later that night, and Ethan was pulled into 3 more briefings, but his mind kept circling back to 3 things. Wade was protected, Nadia was on a watch list, and the warning message had come at exactly the wrong and right moment. He left the meeting after 9, stood alone in the parking lot for a few minutes, trying to stitch everything together. One abuse of power shouldn't come with 3 layers of protection. A USB drive doesn't crawl into someone's bag on its own. A small-town cop doesn't just happen to stop the exact right person without being pointed. At the apartment, Nadia was still sitting on the chair, lights on. She had stayed there for over an hour, not out of fear, but because the thoughts in her head wouldn't stop linking together. The message made something crystal clear. The vague dread she had felt for weeks now had shape. I don't want to see you disappear. That was the voice of someone on the outside. Someone who had seen others vanish, only for life to go on like normal. Except those people never showed up in any official reports again. Ethan opened the door, closing it softly to avoid a loud click. Nadia looked up and asked in a low voice, What did they say at IA? Ethan gave a single answer. That Wade isn't the biggest problem. And with that, Nadia understood. What was unraveling now had nothing to do with a court hearing or disciplinary board. This was about politics, about power, about networks, and about a game people like her had never been allowed to play on their own terms. Nadia placed her hand on her wrist. The burn was still there, but now it felt like a reminder. If they want me to stop, then they know I'm getting close to something. Ethan sat beside her, and neither said another word, because the only thing left between them now was the truth laid bare. They weren't just fighting a broken system. They were touching the hands that kept it broken, no matter what it cost. The next morning, as Nadia opened her laptop to submit her report to CIRU, her inbox lit up with a new message. The sender was listed as Unknown Secure. The subject line had only 3 words. Check your name. She opened it, her hand pausing slightly when she saw the first line. Your name is on the watch list. No greeting. No signature. Just those 8 words, aligned, cold, and written in the tone of internal warnings sent through secure channels before something major happens. Nadia scrolled down and saw another line. Don't trust any report written about you. She leaned back in her chair, her breath thinning, her mind flashing to the image of the USB sitting in her camping bag and the growing sense that everything was now linking together faster than she could stop. A notification popped up in the corner of her screen. DHS had flagged that a file named evlog.9 had just been accessed from an unregistered device. Nadia opened the access log and saw the line she feared most. Access. Unauthorized. Status. Attempting decode. She zoomed in on the timeline, and just as she suspected, the unauthorized attempt happened when the USB had been transferred to DHS's tech division the night before. No one at CIRU was allowed to handle it directly, which meant someone trying to decrypt the data wasn't from Ethan's team. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, and it made every muscle in her shoulders tighten with instinctive alertness. She checked the IP listed in the logs, but the identification had been replaced with a unique numerical tag that she recognized instantly. Code 17. Nadia placed her fingers against the screen, staring at the code like she was looking at the shadow of someone she used to know. 17 was a designation reserved only for units under the category of sensitive grade observers, covert teams assigned to monitor internal threats. She had seen that code only twice in her career. Once during an investigation of a federal employee suspected of leaking data, and once when a senior agent was believed to have passed classified intel to a private firm. Both cases had ended with silent investigations, and the monitored person all but vanishing from the system for months. No one at DHS had the right to use that code without very high-level clearance. Nadia closed her eyes for a second, then reread the anonymous email, turning each word over in her mind. The sender knew her name was under surveillance, knew the USB had been accessed without clearance, knew how to use a hidden channel that left no standard trace. This wasn't a warning from an outsider. This was someone inside, and that someone was at a level high enough to see things most employees never even knew existed. Just a few blocks away, inside a CIRU conference room, Ethan received Nadia's message at the same moment he was reviewing a report analyzing unauthorized surveillance orders within the DHS system. He opened the screenshot she sent of the access log and immediately spotted the 17 tag. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hand pressing against his chin the way he only did when something had moved well beyond protocol. If someone inside DHS had accessed the USB, this wasn't just about local police or Woodlake County anymore. This was federal. And in that world, mistakes were never accidental. Ethan stood up and stepped into the hallway to read the email line by line. "Your name is on the watch list." That sentence sent a chill down his spine. If Nadia was being monitored, that meant someone didn't want her anywhere near what was inside that USB. "I don't want to see you disappear." Ethan gripped the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. This wasn't a threat. It was the message of someone who had seen it happen before. Someone who had watched others be flagged, then quietly erased from the system like they never existed. He walked back into the meeting room, his voice low and dry. Someone accessed the USB while it was at DHS. The room fell silent. A tech division agent asked immediately, "Who has that level of access?" Ethan set the phone down on the table. "No one on the authorized list." The IA officer at the far end of the table raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone inside is playing dirty?" Ethan looked directly at him. "I mean, someone wants to know what Nadia found before we do." The mood in the room shifted. Pens were set down mid-sentence, files were closed, and those who had once suspected the Woodlake incident was just a case of abuse of power now realized something far more dangerous had surfaced. Ethan turned back to the screen, showing the 17 code. "Whoever used that tag isn't just a regular employee. Another agent asked. You think someone at DHS is keeping that data for themselves? Ethan answered crisply. I think someone at DHS is trying to hide what's been watching her. And Wade was just the curtain. Back in her apartment, Nadia held her phone, reading the anonymous email again. Each word felt like a puzzle piece someone had placed exactly where and when she needed it, to show her this wasn't just about a police brutality case anymore. She leaned against the table, her head slightly bowed not out of fear, but from the dizzying realization that the separate fragments of information she'd been chasing were now aligning into a single, dangerous thread. When Ethan called, his voice was low and raspy, but certain. Shut your device down. Don't open any more files. I'm on my way. Nadia looked out the window, where the last light of day reflected off the panes, and replied, I understand. But inside, she knew one thing clearly. The moment that 17 code appeared on her screen, they were no longer up against a small group. They were up against the very system she once served. Inside the IA interrogation room, Torrance slumped deep into his chair, like someone waking up from a power trip he never thought would end so fast. The white light above made his face paler, his hands clasped tightly on the table, sweat beading between his fingers. The IA investigator repeated the question for the second time, voice steady. Did anyone mention the name Nadia Evans to you before the incident? Torrance swallowed hard, lips dry, eyes lowered to the table. He stayed silent for a few seconds, then let out the sentence he knew would turn everything on its head. Yes! The word dropped like a heavy object. The investigator stopped writing, waiting for him to continue. Torrance drew in a shallow breath. Someone didn't say a name. He told me to keep an eye on her if I saw her around the county. He didn't dare meet the investigator's eyes. I thought it was just some basic check. But now I think it wasn't. It doesn't. In the adjacent room, the sound of a hand slamming the table made the glass pane tremble slightly. Wade was standing tall, his face flushed red like someone had yanked him out of a cocoon of confidence he had built over years. He snapped, his voice scraping like metal on stone. I did what I always do. What's wrong with that? How many times now? None of you ever said a damn thing. He paced back and forth, slapping his palm against the wall, eyes bulging. He couldn't understand how things had flipped so fast this time. Couldn't understand how a woman he thought was just like the others had brought Ciru, NAACP, the media, and a tremor across the DHS system into his orbit. He leaned against the wall, hands on hips, breathing like a cornered animal. Y'all are blowing this up. I followed my procedure. The investigator stared at him with a blank look. No agreement, no sympathy. What procedure authorizes you to cuff someone who isn't resisting? Wade clenched his jaw, eyes bloodshot. He wasn't used to explaining himself, especially not to someone with more authority. I know that type. They're always ready to stir something up. The words had barely left his mouth when even he froze. IA noted it all down without missing a beat, and Wade began to realize he was digging himself deeper. While Wade ranted, Torrance sat in silence for another few seconds before speaking again. I didn't think Nadia was a criminal, he said softly, barely above a whisper. I just followed the suggestion. The IA investigator tilted his head slightly. Suggestion? From who? Torrance exhaled sharply, as if each word had to scrape past the little courage he had left. Don't know the name. He just told me, if you see her, report it. When I asked why, he said, just do it. The investigator didn't write right away, only asked the question that made Torrance flinch. Are you willing to cooperate? Torrance stared at his hands, thumbs twisting around each other. I want to, but Wade knows where I live. In the hallway, Ethan stood against the wall, arms crossed. He heard Wade's outbursts echoing through the glass and the shaky low tones coming from Torrance's room. A CIRU agent walked up and handed him a note, just submitted by IA. It had only one sentence. Nadia was targeted before the incident. Ethan held the paper longer than necessary, reading each word like he was forcing himself not to react too soon. But deep in his eyes, the hardest thing to hide was the shift no one wanted to see. What happened to Nadia wasn't some spontaneous abuse by two officers. It had been planned roughly, but not by accident. Ethan turned his head toward Torrance's room just as Torrance looked up through the blurred glass. In that brief moment, all the swagger was gone. There was no trace of the man who had once smirked while pushing someone's face down on a car hood. He looked like someone dragged away from the edge of a cliff he'd helped dig himself. Ethan recognized that look. And tribe. It was the look of someone realizing he was the lowest link in a chain he was never meant to touch beyond his part. At the far end of the hallway, Wade was escorted past, not in cuffs, but with his shoulders hunched like the entire IA building was pressing on his chest. As he passed Ethan, he threw a sharp glance and muttered, voice tight and seething like a suppressed growl, "I was doing my job. Don't turn me into your scapegoat." Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at him, his gaze flat like a mirror that refused to reflect emotion. That silence threw Wade off, and he turned away quickly, as if unable to bear seeing his own reflection in it. A CIRA agent came up beside Ethan, voice low. "You see it now. This is bigger." Ethan nodded slowly. "I see it," the agent added, voice like metal scraping metal. "If someone from DHS is involved, that means this has protection from the top down. And if Wade got a tip from a third party..." Ethan finished the thought. "Then this isn't just police violence. It's a campaign." Is dozen 12. Ethan stood for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the room where Torrance sat trembling slightly in his chair, and the room where Wade raged like an uncapped powder keg. The picture was coming into focus in a way he hadn't wanted. One officer confident in his power because someone had his back. Another subordinate officer who wanted to speak but was afraid of being silenced, and a network behind them. Both strong enough to use the federal system itself to monitor and eliminate the people they wanted gone. He stepped back half a pace, leaning his shoulder against the wall. And for the first time since this case began, Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. Not from fear, but from the realization that what they had uncovered wasn't a shallow pit, but a deep tunnel with no visible end, connecting people he once believed were a world away from men like these. Nadia had been right from the start. Wade didn't act alone. And now Ethan knew. He wasn't the most dangerous man in this story. DHS sent an official notice in the morning, requesting CIRU to hand over all related evidence, including the sealed USB drive and the access log records from the system. The language in the document was so cold, it felt as if they were retrieving a misplaced item, not material tied to an illegal surveillance chain. As Ethan read the notice, Martin Crest called his phone directly, his voice tight and clipped, like someone trying to hold on to patience, but already losing grip. "Do not hand it over," Martin said the second Ethan picked up. "If DHS gets the USB, it'll disappear." Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew Martin wasn't exaggerating. The most important things aren't always destroyed. Sometimes they're just hidden so well, the world forgets they exist. "I'm keeping it in a triple-lock chest," Ethan replied. "And it's not leaving my hands without a direct order from the Controller General." Martin responded quickly. "Good, because I have a feeling someone at DHS wanted to stop her from the start." That same afternoon, a second notice arrived. Nadia was requested to be present in Washington within 3 days to attend a federal hearing concerning sensitive surveillance activity. Ethan looked at her as he read the letter, and for the first time since the incident, Nadia showed a flicker of concern in her eyes. Not because she feared the hearing, but because she understood this was a completely different battleground. One where every word would shape the fate of people who had never been seen clearly in the system. "I have to go," Nadia said, her voice calm but firm. "If I don't, they'll turn this into something small." Ethan gave a slow nod. "I'll go with you." Nadia shook her head. "No, I have to speak alone. I have to be the one standing in front of them." On Tenzer. The Washington headquarters was colder than she expected, and when the hearing began, Nadia sat under bright camera lights next to Martin and a group of civil rights attorneys. The committee questioned her about the USB, about the data, and about why her name appeared in a list of individuals requiring surveillance. Nadia answered without hesitation, her voice steady and direct, like a wire pulled tight. When one congressman asked, "How many people do you think they're monitoring?" Nadia placed both hands on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "Not just me. They're watching a lot of people like me." The whole room quieted not to listen more closely, but because her words opened a door many of them had avoided for years. "From the data I reviewed," Nadia continued, "they flagged black women working in federal agencies, women with access to information, women capable of seeing misconduct." Another Congress member jumped in, voice softer but just as sharp. "You're suggesting there's a targeted campaign against this group?" Nadia responded without pause. "There are signs, and I believe the Woodlake incident was just a way to gauge my response." Martin glanced at her for a second, his eyes offering silent confirmation. Nadia wasn't speaking recklessly. She was saying what she believed, and what she had enough data to infer, even if she couldn't yet lay out all the proof. The committee recorded every word, and the press outside was already preparing new headlines, because her name had become the center of a much larger investigation. While Nadia was testifying, the media tore into her personal life without mercy. They posted pictures of her parents' house, interviewed neighbors, combed through years-old social media, hunting for signs she had ever been defiant or troubled, the way they always do with black victims. One TV network ran the headline, "Nadia Evans, from cybersecurity contractor to controversial federal witness." The word controversial made Ethan slam the table so hard the water glass shook. "They can't write that. She's the victim," Martin replied over the phone. "They'll write anything that draws viewers." One afternoon, just as Nadia was leaving the committee building, a reporter stopped her and asked, "Do you feel you're being judged because of your race?" Nadia paused for half a second. "I feel I'm being judged because of my presence." That answer went viral within minutes, along with a flood of comments from people of color. "She's speaking for all of us." On television, a political commentary show dragged her family into the discussion. They showed photos of her parents, analyzing what class they belonged to, as if her family background explained why she was pinned to the hood of a car. Nadia saw the segment on the hotel screen, a cold feeling rising up her spine. Ethan turned off the TV immediately. "Don't watch this." Nadia crossed her arms, eyes still locked on the screen. "They'll dig up everything to find where I went wrong, because they don't believe someone like me could be a federal witness without hiding something." The next day, another article appeared, this time targeting Ethan. The headline, "Witness's Husband, CIRU Agent Facing Conflict of Interest?" Nadia set the phone down on the table, her eyes slowing for a beat. "They're doing everything they can to discredit me." Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting on the table as if anchoring them to the last patch of solid ground they still had. "And you still have to keep going." Nadia lifted her face, her eyes clearer than ever. "Because this isn't just about me anymore." When the official notice from Washington arrived, confirming that Nadia would be the key witness in the federal investigation into illegal surveillance, Ethan stood beside her, his hand gently placed on her shoulder. She looked down at her wrist, where the marks from the cuffs had faded, but the feeling remained. "This pain will go away," she said softly. "But the other one won't," Ethan asked slowly. "What other one?" Nadia looked straight at him. "The truth that they watch people like me because they think no one will stand up for us." In that moment, Ethan understood that both Washington and Woodlake were now just two sides of the same line Nadia had to cross. And he knew. She was no longer the quiet wife standing beside him in the shadows of the system. She was becoming someone strong enough to pull that system into the light, even if it cost her the privacy and safety she once fought to protect. The suspension notice for Ethan arrived early in the morning, just 2 pages long. But the wording made him freeze in place at CIRU's office door. Conflict of interest. The reason was so brief, it felt like a slap in the face after all the hours he'd poured into this case. No one offered further explanation. No one dared look him in the eye when he signed the acknowledgement. As Ethan stepped into the hallway, agents he had worked with moved aside, not out of contempt, but because they knew the suspension came from higher up, from a level they themselves feared to touch. Ethan stayed calm, but his jaw clenched in that way Nadia had seen before, the way it did when he held back more than he was willing to say. Nadia knew something was wrong. The moment Ethan walked into the apartment, they were using temporarily to avoid the media. He placed the stack of papers on the table, paused for a few seconds to gather himself. Nadia saw the word suspension on the first page and felt her chest tighten. "Because of me?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, but his eyes couldn't hide the truth. "Because they want me out of the way." Nadia leaned against the counter, her old wrist injury throbbing again like a memory being twisted back to life. Everything now rested on her shoulders. No Ethan shielding her, no Ciro standing at her side, no agents tagged to track every step. She was now the only one still holding the original data from the USB. Because Ethan had hidden a copy in a private safe just before the retrieval order came through. That same afternoon, Nadia received 3 phone calls from former colleagues at DHS, all using the same tone that people use when they want to warn you but can't risk revealing themselves. The first was a middle-aged woman, her voice quick and quiet, laced with tension. "Someone's digging into your folders. Be careful. They don't want you to testify." The second was a male colleague who had worked with her on an encryption project, his voice slightly shaking. "Nadia, someone requested your full work history from the last 5 years. I've never seen a request go that deep." The third call came from someone whose name she didn't know. They said only one sentence before hanging up: "Don't stay alone for too long." Nadia set her phone down, sat in a chair, and clasped her hands to steady her breathing. She'd thought she was used to danger. Working in cybersecurity had taught her that every system has vulnerabilities, and everyone has something to hide. But the danger she faced now wasn't coming from hackers, faulty systems, or street cops. It was coming from people in clean suits, people with the authority to sign orders, people who could wipe entire files from the system without leaving a trace. That kind of danger didn't shout. It calculated. Ethan stepped out to the balcony to call Martin and Ciro. When he returned, his voice was low and heavy. "Martin says there's someone inside trying to block the committee from bringing you into the second hearing." Nadia looked at him, trying to keep her eyes from trembling. "Why?" Ethan pulled up a chair beside her. "Because if you say more, they're afraid you'll hit the exact nerve someone's trying to hide." Nadia took a deep breath to push back the knot rising in her throat. "Ethan! How big is this?" Ethan met her eyes without flinching. "Big enough that they were willing to suspend me just to move you into a blind spot." The room went quiet enough that they could hear cars passing on the street below. Nadia leaned her forehead into her hand, the words she'd heard all day circling in her head. "Be careful. They don't want you to testify. They're digging through your work history. Your name's on the surveillance list." Each line now snapped into place, forming a path so clear she couldn't doubt it anymore. Someone knew what she had seen, knew what the USB contained, and wanted her off the witness stand before everything unraveled. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare, soft gesture in the middle of all the chaos. "I know they think you're bait." Nadia opened her eyes and looked straight at him. "Bait for who?" Ethan spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "For the shadow that's been watching you." Nadia pushed her chair back half a step, her chest tightening for a moment, not out of fear, but because she now realized everything Wade had done was just the visible part. The part she couldn't see, the part using her as an anchor, was where the real danger lived. She clenched her fists, a sudden tremor hitting not from simple fear, but from the awareness that the next few steps might decide whether she still had a chance to stand at that hearing. Ethan spoke softly. "Nadia, you're not the only one they're targeting, but you're the one they're watching the hardest." Nadia exhaled sharply through her nose, trying to keep her voice from cracking. "I understand." She stood up and looked out the window, where the late afternoon light glazed over buildings that looked deceptively peaceful. "And I know. The person trying to silence me this time isn't standing on the street." Ethan looked at his wife, and he knew one thing for certain. The danger now didn't wear a uniform. It carried a business card. CIRU's technical team took more than 8 hours to break through the first layer of encryption on the USB. And when the words "Vigil Track Inner Ops" appeared on screen, the entire room went silent, as if someone had just opened a basement door in a building. Everyone suspected, but had never been allowed to see inside. One agent zoomed in on the folder and immediately found a list of files labeled with user codes, timestamps, and surveillance zones. No one said anything when the first line came up. Vigil Track Internal Monitoring Initiative. Ethan stared at those 3 words, as if they might rearrange themselves into something harmless. But they didn't. Vigil Track was not any sanctioned DHS program. It was an internal project, set up illegally to monitor personnel based on criteria banned by every federal law: race, position, and access to information. Another agent opened the 3rd log file, and Nadia felt her throat tighten as the list came up like an inventory checklist. Target: Evans, N. Next to it were 3 characters she never imagined seeing beside her name. Priority: A. She placed her hand on the table to keep steady, not from shock, but because this cold confirmation turned every suspicion she'd shared with Ethan into evidence-backed reality. She asked quietly, "How long?" An agent scrolled down the timeline. "Start point: 2 years ago." Nadia closed her eyes for a moment. That was exactly when she had argued with Ethan about a serious violation he had chosen to stay silent about, to protect the agency. When she opened them again, Ethan saw no blame in her gaze, only the pain of someone realizing a part of her life had been categorized as high-priority surveillance. The lead decoder scrolled further and opened the Authorization Chain section. The approval list appeared, line by line, and the name at the top made Ethan stand upright. Harold Quinn? A heavy silence dropped over the room, as if everyone understood the weight of discovering a DHS regional deputy director heading up an illegal surveillance program. An IA agent whispered, "Quinn oversees both internal security and nuclear relations. He can coordinate with local police if he wants." Ethan nodded slowly, piecing the chain together in the most dangerous order. Wade and Torrance weren't accidents. They were links in a much larger chain. That larger chain had a name: Quinn. Another file was opened, showing the list of field units used as enforcers for Vigil Track. Ethan read it slowly. Woodlake PD Liaison. W. Haynes. The IA investigator behind him said softly, "That's the guy who signed off on clearing 4 of Wade's charges." Nadia looked toward the screen, her thoughts aligning like a thread being pulled tight. Quinn backed him. Her words came out like a breath, but they shifted the atmosphere in the room. Ethan straightened up, his voice dropping to that low register he rarely used with subordinates. So nothing Wade did was ever too far. It was sanctioned. A tech agent clicked again, opening the communication logs. Field request, target location confirmation. The timestamp matched the exact day Nadia arrived in Woodlake. The sender wasn't named, but the region code displayed stopped everyone in place. HQ Sector 2. Ethan said quietly. Quinn used his personal code. That code was restricted to the highest level in the sector, those authorized to issue orders directly to county police, under the cover of internal coordination. A Siru agent tapped a pen on the instances of by table, his expression like stone. That means he ordered surveillance on Nadia himself. No other department involved. As is, Nadia stared at the screen. Not in surprise, but because the rawness of the truth made every vein in her chest burn. They had been watching her for 2 years, raised her priority level when she was assigned to the data leak analysis project, and then sent Wade, someone used to abusing power, someone used to being shielded, to approach her as a test. No threats, no secrecy. Just one afternoon in Woodlake was enough. Ethan leaned down, both hands braced on the edge of the table, as if trying to stop himself from smashing something in the room. He spoke slowly, one word at a time. If Quinn is the one who launched Vigil Track, he knows what's in the USB, and knows Nadia saw it. An IA agent cut in, voice just barely trembling. If he knows she knows, he won't let her make it to the second hearing. Nadia stood upright, her hands clenched but her voice steady. Quinn thinks I don't deserve to exist if I've seen his wrongdoing. The briefing room fell silent for several long seconds. Then a Siru agent said, "Now we know who ordered the surveillance." Ethan looked up, eyes ice cold. Quinn. The name hit the table like a dagger. And every wiped trace of Wade, every vanished allegation, every so-called check targeting women of color, is inside Vigil Track. A young agent asked, voice skipping. "What do you think he'll do to us once he finds out the USB was decrypted?" Ethan answered, without hesitation. "He won't come for CIRU first. He'll come for Nadia." Nadia stared at the screen, at her name tagged beside the words, Priority A. She didn't flinch, but a layer of cold slid down from her spine to her feet. It wasn't fear. It was the clear awareness that Quinn was no longer just a name on paper. He was someone with the power to erase or preserve people's lives in a system that never wanted someone like her to have a voice. In that room, thick with static and CPU heat, no one said another word. Vigil Track was exposed. Quinn was exposed. And Nadia understood. Whatever had her in its sights wasn't finished. It had only just shown its face. The federal prosecutor held a press conference as soon as the indictment was signed. Her voice clear and firm enough that no one in the press room dared whisper. Wade Harris and Kyle Torrance are charged with 3 counts: abuse of power, assault, and unlawful detention. Cameras flashed non-stop as she read each section, while Wade was escorted out of the county headquarters with a face full of rage, still muttering something under his breath, though his eyes shattered. The moment he realized the very law he once leaned on was now turning back to crush him. Torrance followed behind, head bowed, his steps half a beat slower, like someone who already knew there was nowhere left to run. The axis of power in Woodlake officially shifted, and for the first time in their careers, both men had to stand before the same system they once used to suppress others. At the same time, in Washington, a bigger headline was brewing. Harold Quinn was placed on temporary suspension from his position as Regional Deputy Director of DHS. No fanfare, no long statements, just a short directive from the director's office. Temporarily suspended pending investigation. But anyone who's worked in federal circles knew what that really meant. Once a regional post is frozen like that, it means the committee in charge has found enough to widen the entire case. VigilTrack was no longer just a name on a USB. It was now officially part of a federal investigation. One agent told Ethan in the hallway, "When they suspend someone at regional level, it means they've hit the main wire." Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes on the list of other victims now pulled into the file. "And it means they'll have to answer for why that program existed in the first place." Nadia was invited and also compelled to testify in both cases. The abuse of power in Woodlake and the unlawful surveillance inside DHS. She sat at her desk, a spread of documents laid out before her, every timestamp, every report, every data file. Martin called in, his voice low but sharp, just like when he spoke on national television. "You'll be the key witness. No one else has the original data, but you." Nadia made notes, her hand tightening slightly as she reread the line. Priority A, next to her name. Ethan stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of her chair, the last quiet form of protection he could offer. "You're going to tell them everything?" he asked softly. Nadia nodded. "I won't let anyone else be watched without knowing it, like I was." As night fell, and the trial was less than 14 hours away, Nadia sat alone in the quiet apartment, a laptop in front of her, but the screen dark. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the noise from the press, from online comments, from the digging into her family that the media had continued all week. Ethan was downstairs with CIRU, finalizing the testimony outline and witness protection route for the morning session. Nadia stepped out onto the balcony to breathe, pulling her jacket closer. The air was cold, but the colder chill came from the feeling that someone was watching a sensation she'd grown used to since VigilTrack came to light. When she stepped back inside, her eyes caught something near the door. A white envelope lay at the edge of the rug. No sender name, no postage mark. Nadia froze for half a second, then bent down to pick it up. It was thin, light, sealed loosely, like the sender didn't want to leave fingerprints. She opened it with the edge of her nail and pulled out the sheet inside. A single sentence sat in the center of the page, handwritten in a neat, slight slant, the kind of handwriting from someone used to filing reports. "The one who gave the order is still watching." Nadia stood still, not a muscle moving. There was no direct threat in that line, but it was as sharp as a knife sliding across her wrist without cutting. The sender knew she was going to testify, knew she was still priority A, knew where she was, even though CIRU had changed locations 3 times to avoid surveillance. Ethan re-entered the room, the door clicking softly shut behind him. He saw the look on her face before he saw the paper. "Nadia?" She handed him the envelope without a word she didn't need to. Ethan read it, his grip tightening until the paper curled at the corner, his eyes darkening a shade. "This isn't a warning," Ethan said slowly. "It's a statement." Nadia stepped back, her spine against the table, one hand on her stomach, like she was holding down the breath that had just slipped out of her chest. "They want me to know they're still behind it." Ethan set the page down, his voice like steel. "And they want you scared." Nadia looked at the empty envelope on the table, then lifted her eyes, steady and unshaken. "But tomorrow I'll speak. I'll tell it all." Ethan stepped closer, stood beside her, his eyes still on the words lying on the table. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow we let the light do the rest." And in that room, so quiet they could hear the tick of the clock, they both understood that tomorrow's trial wasn't just about convicting Wade or exposing VigilTrack. It was about unmasking the one who gave the order, dragging into daylight the person still watching from the shadows, and revealing what the system had buried for years. And Nadia would be the one standing at the center of it alone, but not bowed. The courtroom this morning was packed, not with noise but with the weight of hundreds of held breaths. Nadia stepped up to the witness stand, her hands placed in front of her, head held high. She didn't flinch from the cameras and didn't look toward Wade or Torrance sitting below. Her voice was steady, not shaking, free of hatred, just the calm of someone who had been torn from her safe zone for too long to still know fear. She recounted every detail precisely. How Wade approached without saying a word, how he grabbed her arm and forced her face against the hot metal, how Torrance stood behind laughing and saying things the entire country now knew. Not a whisper interrupted her. Even the sound of typing stopped, as if the court feared throwing off the rhythm of her voice. When the prosecution played the body cam footage, it was as if someone grabbed the entire room by the neck and dragged it back to that afternoon. The screen showed Nadia's face pressed against the hood, and Wade's voice rang out dry, like stone falling. "Calm down, ma'am. I know you're kind." The subtitles followed word for word. No softening, no filter. And the guttural snarl in his tone made a few people in the back rows inhale sharply. Nadia looked at the screen, but her face did not change. The court saw that, and her composure landed heavier than any scream. The prosecutor stood upright, turned toward the defense. "Officer Harris? Is that your voice?" Wade didn't answer. His jaw locked tight, eyes fixed on the table like he was searching for a way into the floor. Torrance looked away, clutching the edge of his seat. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stepped up to the witness stand, suit crisp, but his face carried the weight of someone who'd spent all night fighting the system. The prosecutor looked down at the prepared questions and asked the one many had been waiting for. "Mr. Evans, do you believe your wife's testimony?" The room froze, as if his answer would shift the axis of the entire morning. Ethan looked straight at Nadia, his eyes steady, focused on no one else. "I believe every word." His voice wasn't loud, but it landed like iron. "And if this system doesn't believe her, then the problem is with the system, not with her." A murmur rippled through the room, fast and sharp like a jolt through a machine left silent too long. Nadia breathed in softly, not out of emotion, but because what he said wasn't meant to comfort her. It was meant to drive straight into the reason she had to stand there in the first place. When closing arguments ended, the judge returned, gaze stern but not cold. "Based on the evidence, the testimony, and the recorded footage," he said, "this court finds the actions of Officers Wade Harris and Kyle Torrance to constitute severe abuse of power, assault, and unlawful arrest." Wade shut his eyes at the words, "severe abuse of power." Torrance's shoulders slumped, like a man watching his future slam shut. The judge continued with sentencing. Harris, 8 years in prison. Torrance, 5 years in prison and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. The gavel struck sharp and final, followed by a unified exhale from the public gallery. But the Woodlake case was only half of the morning. The federal prosecutor submitted another file, thick enough to make many in the room lean forward slightly. "Unauthorized surveillance," she said, "connected to the Vigil Track program." When the name was spoken aloud, a few reporters' heads snapped up, and Ethan glanced at Nadia in a silent beat. The prosecutor pointed to the front page. Defendant, Harold Quinn, Regional Deputy Director of DHS. Again, the room fell silent, as if the air had been sucked out. Quinn wasn't present, but his attorney sat to the right, face stiff and unreadable. The prosecutor read the charges in a flat tone. Abuse of federal authority, establishing an unauthorized surveillance program targeting personnel and citizens of color, concealment and coordination of field units to collect illegal data. It's not. When a federal representative asked Nadia, "Can you confirm your name was on the priority list?" She nodded. "Yes." "Priority level?" Nadia looked directly at the bench. "A." No one in the room moved, but highlighters touched paper almost in unison. The prosecutor closed the file. The court will open a separate federal trial for Harold Quinn in 2 weeks. Nadia stood with her hands clasped, eyes still raised. She knew she had only made it halfway through. When the judge declared the Woodlake hearing adjourned, Wade was taken away first, the metal cuffs clicking the same sound he had once confidently fastened onto her wrist in Woodlake. Torrance followed, never once lifting his eyes. The courtroom stood as the judge exited. Reporters surged into the hallway, rushing to file the first stories. Martin stepped beside Nadia and placed a light hand on her shoulder. "You did it." Nadia breathed slowly, not out of relief, but because she could feel the tremor spreading beyond these 4 walls. Ethan joined her, his expression calmer than it had been that morning, but still holding the familiar trace of caution. The verdict had been delivered. Wade and Torrance could no longer hide behind their badges. Quinn would face federal court. But as Nadia stepped down from the courthouse steps, sunlight hit her face, and she knew one thing no one inside could shield her from. The eyes of the one still watching had not vanished. And the next chapter of this fight began right where her foot touched the pavement. Nadia stepped out of the federal courthouse just as the last light of day faded behind the rooftops. The sky darkened in a way that signaled a cold front approaching, not the sharp cold of winter, but the kind that tightens skin, like a warning that tonight would not end like other nights. The stone walkway in front of the courthouse still echoed with footsteps of reporters chasing after prosecutors for statements, but the space in front of Nadia was strangely empty, as if someone had cleared it ahead of time to keep her apart from the rest of the world. Ethan followed a few steps behind, still mid-conversation with Martin, while Nadia paused on the courthouse steps, feeling the wind strike her cheek as if to pull her back into reality after the trial had just ended. She took a deep breath, then slowly made her way down. On the sidewalk, rows of media vans were lined up, but the bright lights from reporter cameras were dimming now, redirected toward newer targets. And just when Nadia thought she might be able to walk the short distance to the CIRU vehicle parked down the block, a man stepped out from the shadow of a street lamp. He didn't rush forward, didn't call out her name, didn't try to draw attention. He simply walked toward her at a measured pace, just slow enough to avoid looking threatening. When he was only a few steps away, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, aged cream envelope. Nadia didn't take it right away. Her eyes scanned the street, the 2 cars at the corner, the courthouse security office. Nothing seemed off, and that was the most unsettling part. The man extended the envelope, his voice low and wind-like. "For you." No other words. He didn't say her name, didn't explain, didn't make eye contact again. He turned and walked away the second the envelope changed hands, vanishing between 2 parked SUVs like a passing shadow, dissolving into the cold air. Ethan saw the movement from a distance and quickened his pace, but the man had disappeared completely. No footsteps, no features memorable enough to recall. Nadia opened the envelope right there, her palms cool against the coarse paper. Inside wasn't a threat, nor a familiar message like those sent by people trying to silence her. It was a photo printed sharp and clear, detailed enough to show the veins on her wrist where the cuffs had dug in. It captured the moment in Woodlake, when her head was forced down onto the hood of a car, the seams of her pink blazer clearly pressed, and Wade's shadow cast over her face. But it was the angle that made Nadia freeze. The photo had been taken from roughly 40 to 50 meters up, from a diagonal tilt as if from an airborne device. Not a park camera, not a hobbyist drone, not an accidental bystander. This was the angle of a dedicated surveillance system, the kind only authorized internal units or programs like VigilTrack had access to. Ethan reached her side just then, saw the expression on her face, and took the photo from her hand. When he flipped up the bottom edge of the image, a line of small code printed in ink, barely visible under the street lamp, came into view. Vigil Track Master. Not inner ops, like in the USB. Not Sector 2. This was the system's highest-level access, so restricted that even many deputy directors were locked out. Ethan looked at the code, his face tightening like someone staring at a monster they thought had already been beheaded. Nadia. This isn't old, he said quietly. This photo was just pulled from the system. Vigil Track is still running. Nadia looked at the photo again, this time not with the eyes of a victim, but with the clarity of someone who now understood just how many people like her were caught in the net. Quinn was suspended, she said softly, but the system's still active. Ethan swallowed hard, the truth now so sharp it hurt. Vigil Track was never just Quinn's operation. Exposing him had only pushed the rest of the network deeper underground. Cold wind swept across the courthouse plaza, brushing Nadia's hair to one side. She held the photograph in her hand, the edge of the paper pressing into her palm like a thin blade. On the street, a few people who had just left the courthouse recognized her. But they didn't come close. They stood at a distance, watching with the eyes of those who had just witnessed an explosion and were still trying to guess if another was coming. Martin ran over, but when he saw the photo in Ethan's hand, he stopped short. He whispered, "There's no way they still have access." Ethan answered flatly, "They do, even without Quinn." Nadia looked at both of them, then back at the photo. The code stamp, the camera angle, all of it sparked the final ember in her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't helplessness. It was a kind of resolve she had never felt this strong before. She stepped down one more stair, standing in the path of the evening wind sweeping in from the avenue, lifting her face toward the sky where violet met the city lights. Her voice rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the space between the three of them. If they think a lone black woman is easy to push down, they're about to see how wrong they are. Ethan looked at her like a man watching someone step into the next chapter without bowing her head. Martin stayed silent, but nodded slightly, as if to confirm that what was unfolding now was no longer about Woodlake, no longer about Quinn, but about a much larger front, where Vigil Track was no longer hidden behind code, and Nadia Evans was the first to look straight at it. She tightened her grip on the photo one last time, before walking toward the CIRU SUV waiting in the distance. Not to hide, not to flee, but to prepare for the next battle. Project Rise began in that moment, with a photograph, a declaration, and a woman no longer willing to be watched from above, without watching back.